Hitler wanted blitzkrieg from above. As the German military prepared to face off against Russia's underestimated yet formidable tank forces in Operation Barbarossa, Hitler belatedly realized the need for a tank-hunting, close-support aircraft. The Henschel HS-129 was supposed to fill this role as Germany's Panzerknacker, or tank breaker. However, it proved anything but. Despite being piloted by record-breaking airman Rudolf Heinz Rüffer while taking out 80 tanks, the plane struggled to achieve wider success in World War II. Unfortunately for the Luftwaffe, the HS-129 was rushed to the battlefield, saddled with requirements and design choices that doomed its capabilities early on. Development was too slow, production was flawed, and the aircraft was never built in the quantities necessary to impact any significant battle of the war. Adolf Hitler did not want to fight a trench war like World War I with slow progress. He desired to see Germany advance through the chessboard rapidly and decisively, recovering Germany's historical territory and expanding it. His strategy required a special aircraft to support ground troops, a tank hunter. By the years leading up to World War II, the European countries had come to the conclusion that bomber aircraft were essential to disrupting enemy logistics and equipment because the targets were often ill-equipped. Protected tactical objectives and high-value targets were more vulnerable to dive bombers than ground troops. As the Second World War broke out, dive bombers quickly established a pivotal role in the conflict. Yet Germany's Condor Legion had proven that an alternative to the dive bomber might exist after being deployed to the Spanish Civil War. Despite being thought of as not suited for ground attacks, the cannon-armed Hinkel HE-112 and the Henschel HS-123 fulfilled the role dutifully. Having proven very effective in this combative role, the Reichsluftministerium decided they needed an aircraft solely devoted to taking out cannons, machine guns, and other ground defenses, rather than only bombing select targets. For this purpose, they sent out a specification in April of 1947 for a heavily armored small aircraft with 2 or more guns of at least 20mm and 7.9 machine guns. They also required low-powered engines and 75mm glazing for the cockpit windows. They anticipated that such an aircraft would be attacked by small arms fire from enemy troops, which required heavy protection for the cockpit, engines, and body. Bulletproof glass for the canopy would protect the pilot. Such an aircraft would focus on low-level head-on attacks, which meant the cockpit needed to be close to the nose for visibility. Furthermore, the RLM wanted engines that were not used in any other plane, so as to avoid interference with the production run of the rest of the fleet. This decision would play a critical factor in limiting the effectiveness of the project. Four companies were asked to send submissions, with only 2 being deemed worthy of consideration. The Focke-Wulf and Henschel proposals battled it out. The Focke-Wulf proposal sought to modify the FW-189 with a heavily armored nacelle. Henschel proposed a new twin-engine single-seat aircraft. Both designs were examined, and in October of the same year, the RLM awarded preliminary contracts to both companies. Still, Henschel ultimately won the final decision. Their design work began in January of 1938, getting the designation HS-129 for the plane in April. The visual mock-up was ready at the end of July, and by August, all design details were concretized. The least appealing part of the aircraft design was the Argus AS-410A0 engine, which was not very powerful. Despite claims that it would result in 465 horsepower, it only ever produced 430 horsepower, making the whole design deficient. The ground attack aircraft prototype V1 flew for the first time on May 26, 1939. After the first flight, the prototype underwent several changes. However, on June 24th, the prototype was almost lost during a crash landing. The 2 original prototypes were tested and subjected to modifications through the autumn of 1939. Neither was turning out to impress. They suffered from low power and terrible visibility. Still, the Henschel aircraft was 1/3 as expensive as the design created by Focke-Wulf, so the Reichsluftfahrtministerium decided to go with their project. 2 subsequent prototypes were delayed due to shortages of materials and key equipment. The V2's entire engine had to be removed before completion to repair the V1. The V2 was finally completed and flew for the first time on November 30th, 1939. Both versions had significant engine problems. They were unreliable, and with increased aircraft weight, their performance decreased. The plane struggled to pull up after a dive, and the V2 was ultimately destroyed in 1940 after it crashed due to a related failure. The V3 was not ready for flight until the beginning of April 1940. Henschel gave it the improved Argus AS-410A1 engine, which still proved to be unreliable. The V3 crashed in June 1940 and was in respiration until March of the following year, leaving the V1 as the only working prototype for that period. The Erprobungskommando 129 was created as a special unit to bring the aircraft into operational service. During original runs in November of 1940, the pilots complained about the engines and visibility. As a solution, Henschel proposed building a larger version of the aircraft, the P-76, which would have used two 700-horsepower Gnome and Renault 14M radial engines. Instead, they were ordered to use the French engines on refitted airframes of the original model to avoid any delays. The engine upgrade worked, but even though the situation had improved, it was still not optimal. A new canopy design also improved the visibility issues. The production and deployment of the HS-129 suffered from complications with the design and poor decisions from the high command of the Luftwaffe. They had underestimated the need for a plane that could take out tanks until it was too late in the war. During Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the USSR, the German intelligence community had calculated that the Soviets had around 10,000 battle tanks. To their surprise, the Soviets brought out over twice as many. The Germans were prone to mistakes of this sort during the last years of the war. Furthermore, the Third Reich government did not create an environment where Henschel could successfully produce grand quantities of its aircraft. As an all-purpose manufacturer, they were ordered to build planes and parts for other companies. This meant that aside from the 8 production prototypes and the 3 design prototypes, the HS-129 had a small production of 870 aircraft. This number pales in comparison to the 33,000 Messerschmitt Bf-109s the Luftwaffe used. Once most of these 870 planes were in service, the German army was already in a defensive role and desperate. Although the HS-129 did prove to be effective against Soviet tanks, they were rarely present with sufficient armament and in large enough quantities. There were never more than 5 squadrons of these aircraft for a battle. Still, the HS-129 was also haunted by design issues. It was incredibly slow. If fully loaded, it could only achieve a top speed of less than 200 miles per hour. Furthermore, the projected 3-inch canopy glass limited the pilot's view. For the entirety of its deployment, it had a poor climb rate and a slow and long takeoff run. To make things worse, the French engines on the plane were susceptible to sand and dust, making them seize during flight with no previous indication that something was going wrong. Yet most of the HS-129 pilots enjoyed the aircraft due to its safety features. It was considered almost indestructible. Pilot Rudolf Heinz Ruffer became a ground attack record breaker by achieving the destruction of 80 tanks, mostly from an HS-129. He went down in history and received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. He was a strong proponent of the aircraft due to its role in making him a tank-killing ace. Unfortunately for Ruffer, his streak came to an end in 1944. While flying over Poland, his HS-129 was hit by a Soviet anti-aircraft gun that made the plane explode. Some of the HS-129 squadrons were sent to North Africa after the Allies took El Alamein. They entered the battle in November of 1942. Their deployment was a big mistake. The engines had inferior dust filters and quickly overheated, making the aircraft a terrible choice for battles in the desert. This ended up destroying almost every unit. During their very first engagement, they were hit by 2 sandstorms that forced the Germans to ferry them to the west. By the end of December, the 7 surviving planes arrived in Tripoli, but none of them were operational. 3 of them were destroyed during an air raid, and 3 more were deemed irreparable. The 1 surviving plane was sent to the Eastern Front. A new wave of HS-129s was sent to North Africa at the beginning of 1943. Planes were sent behind German lines to destroy tanks without anti-aircraft defenses that had made it past the front lines. While this reduced aircraft losses for the Germans, it also limited the usability of the HS-129. Furthermore, the planes had to be escorted due to newfound Allied control over the air. As the number of available escort fighters went down, the Luftwaffe ordered all HS-129 units to evacuate. By the end of August 1943, all remaining planes were at the Eastern Front. The HS-129 was considerably effective when it first fought with the Germans. It was introduced to service in the Eastern Front in multiple frontline roles. Since the main goal was to have the aircraft work as anti-tank support, it underwent several gun upgrades. Eventually, the HS-129 was given a 75mm gun that reduced mobility and speed to the point that made the aircraft barely flyable. Their biggest weakness was the lack of large available numbers. By February 1943, only 3 squadrons were using the planes. If they were employed at full strength, There would only be 40 operational HS-129s on the Eastern Front at any given time, and this rarely happened. It was then decided to move the aircraft from the front lines. Only the Soviet tanks that broke through were destroyed by the German planes. Oberlieutenant Otto Weiss took over command of the 3 units in early April 1943, and by the end of the summer, he had control of 5 HS-129 units due to the arrival of those evacuated from Africa. Over the remainder of the spring and early summer, the aircraft were used to fight in the Russian Taman Peninsula. They were withdrawn in anticipation of the Battle of Kursk, where the German Mk-103 10mm cannon debuted to bitter disappointment. Still, the HS-129s were valuable at the battle, since they destroyed multiple Soviet tanks. Unfortunately, there were still not enough HS-129s to change the outcome. The situation repeated during the retreat from Ukraine. The Germans began to incur significant air losses with the increasing strength of Soviet fighter squadrons and anti-aircraft guns. The slow HS-129 could not stand a chance. Beginning in 1944, the Germans were launching their last desperate attempts to stop the Soviet offensive that came after their victory in Kursk. The Germans were thrown back out of Soviet territory entirely by spring. The HS-129 served in the last streak of defensive defeats, with the aircraft's maintenance in steep decline. Production was halted by the fall of 1944, and by the end of the World War, there were almost no HS-129s still airworthy. Due to lack of fuel, none of them were flying by then anyway. Time was running out for the US soldiers, Marines, and their allies in Vietnam. The war in Indochina was raging on, and the US Air Force was struggling to develop a new aircraft that could replace the aging World War II-era fighters used for close air support. Without proper CAS, the men on the ground were barely able to fight the North Vietnamese and come out of the thick jungles unscathed. As the situation reached crisis proportions, the Air Force finally launched an ambitious program to develop a new close air support platform, the AX program. Only 2 prototype aircraft were chosen for the tight competition, with Northrop's YA-9 coming out victorious. Time was now of the essence to have it ready on time and help the ground troops in Vietnam push back the communists. Military aviation reached an unprecedented level of technological advancement during World War II, and one of them was a dedicated strike aircraft designed for close air support, or CAS. The objective of these warplanes was to provide support to friendly ground troops with heavy fire from the air. The aircraft with this role were the Lockheed P-38 Lightning and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. However, in September of 1947, the U.S. Army Air Force turned into the United States Air Force, a new separate branch of the armed forces, leading to a series of restrictions on the type of fixed-wing aircraft the Army could acquire and produce. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, the USAF used the powerful Douglas Skyraider to fulfill the CAS role and support the U.S. Army, Marines, South Koreans, and other UN allied forces. As the years passed, the Skyraider began to show its age, even more so when compared to other World War II-era aircraft that fulfilled such a role during the Vietnam War. The Army could no longer rely on the USAF for close air support and decided to push its own program forward with the AAFSS Advanced Aerial Fire Support System. Consequently, the program produced the short-lived Lockheed AH-56 Cheyenne attack helicopter, but the Air Force considered it a threat and decided to develop a new CAS aircraft to use in Vietnam. Worried about coming up with a proper replacement for the Douglas Skyraider, the Air Force staff began to look for a quick way to solve the problem the branch had at hand, finding an innovative CAS design before the Army came up with a more efficient experiment like that of the AH-56 Cheyenne attack helicopter. Time was running out, and USAF Chief of Staff General John P. McConnell knew it well. First and foremost, the lives of Army soldiers, Marines, South Koreans, and other Allied forces fighting over the Vietnamese jungles and hills were at stake. The inefficiencies of the aging CAS aircraft were taking their toll on the men fighting the communists, and sooner or later, the Air Force would be blamed. With this in mind, McConnell followed up on his concerns with an innovative close air support aircraft design, noting that the ongoing competition with the U.S. Army was also a matter of prestige. After many attempts, the USAF finally issued a Requirements Action Directive, or RAD, in December of 1966. The objective was simple: to develop a dedicated close air support aircraft with the latest technological innovations. By March of 1967, the Requirements Action Directive evolved into the AX, or Attack Experimental Program Office, tasked with coming up with the desired design. After establishing the basic parameters, the Program Office issued the specifications to over 20 defense contractors with a Request for Information, or RFI, guide. The Air Force then awarded multiple study contracts to companies such as Grumman, McDonnell, General Dynamics, and Northrop to develop the best design, armor, equipment, engine, fuel, and weaponry for the USAF's first CAS aircraft. The intent was to develop a low-cost aircraft with low-level maneuverability, low maintenance requirements, heavy ordnance load, rough field operational capabilities, a strong airframe for pilot survivability, and a speed of over 400 miles per hour. With the Vietnam War in full swing, the Army and the Marines desperately needed all the air support they could muster to fight off the Viet Cong guerrilla and the well-disciplined North Vietnamese army. While the defense contractors were still conducting preliminary studies for the AX aircraft, a series of grim circumstances slowed the project. Besides the ongoing confrontations across the Indochina landscape, tensions kept rising with the Soviet Union over Europe. Both the Army and the Air Force had been conducting military studies regarding how they would react to an invasion of Western Europe by the USSR and its allies. The US and NATO concluded that if such an attack ever came to be, soldiers stationed at the borders with the USSR would need all the close air support they could get to attack armored infantry vehicles and Soviet tanks. As such, the USAF made some tweaks to the original request for proposal so that it could also serve in a possible combat scenario against the Soviet Union in Western Europe. The new requirements included a maximum speed of over 460 miles per hour, a takeoff distance of over 4,000 feet, a 285-mile range, a payload of 16,000 pounds, and an expected aircraft cost of almost $1.4 million. Moreover, they were looking for an all-weather aircraft armed with a gun capable of tearing apart advancing Soviet armor. Knowing that other companies were already busy developing the different components of the AX aircraft, the USAF decided to issue a separate request for proposal for the main armament of the CAS aircraft. As such, veteran pilots from the Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marines were consulted about the performance of the 20mm M61 Vulcan cannon during their tours of duty in Vietnam. The M61 Vulcan had become the standard cannon of numerous fixed-wing and rotary-wing aircraft, and the Air Force was keen on hearing such opinions. The consensus was that the 20mm Vulcan was well-liked and an extremely powerful weapon against most targets. Even so, it had one defect. As the war progressed and the North Vietnamese acquired newer armored vehicles, the Vulcan proved incapable of dismantling targets with thicker armor. Thus, the USAF concluded that a rotary gun with a larger caliber was necessary. Moreover, the AX aircraft had to be fitted with a gigantic 30mm rotary cannon with the desired fire rate of over 4,000 rounds a minute. Only Philco Ford and General Electric came up with designs for the 30mm gun, and the prototype rotary cannon was designated GAU-8 in mid-1971. Soon, the USAF called for the development of 4 different types of ammunition: armor-piercing incendiary, target practice, high-explosive incendiary, and semi-armor-piercing high-explosive rounds. By 1974, the powerful gun was ready for combat. Six companies submitted proposals to the U.S. Air Force, but only Northrop and the Fairchild Republic were selected. Both companies were awarded a contract in December of 1970 to develop prototypes. They were the YA-9A and the YA-10A. Northrop's YA-9 design went the conventional way, with a design that resembled an upsized Bell P-59 Aerocomet, the first jet-powered aircraft developed by the U.S. during World War II. The YA-9 was a monoplane of all-riveted aluminum alloy construction, with chemically milled skins and honeycomb structures. It featured straight shoulder-mounted wings that gave ample space to store underwing weapons. In addition, the wings also housed the fuel required by the U.S. Air Force. The Northrop engineers also made this decision to keep any flammable materials away from ignition sources and prevent instant damage if the aircraft was shot during combat. Regarding aerodynamics, the wing design improved control when flying at lower altitudes, which was critical for the CAS role. The aircraft's cockpit was located aft, ahead of the leading edge of the wings. The pilot sat in a nose cone assembly with a bubble-style canopy that offered excellent visibility of the surroundings. Moreover, the cockpit was encircled by a bathtub of armor made of aluminum for the prototype, but envisioned with titanium if approved for production. And all the controls were standard for aircraft of the time. The YA-9's dual hydraulic flight control system had a manual backup to prevent a single hit from causing control failure. It was powered by two Lycoming YF-102 LD-100 turbofan engines that generated 7,500 pounds of thrust each and supported a maximum speed of over 520 miles per hour. The engines were based on the Avro Lycoming T-55 turboshaft that powered Bell's CH-47 Chinook and had a rate of climb of 5,000 feet per minute. They were located on either side of the fuselage under the wings and exhausted near the tail unit. The prototype had a large cruciform stabilizer that improved directional stability for low-level flight, and its tail assembly comprised a single vertical tail fin with upward-tilted horizontal planes located along its side. Split ailerons were also fitted in the wings and could be used as air brakes. Coupled with the aircraft's rudder, sideways control forces could be applied without yawing to facilitate weapon aiming. In addition, the YA-9 featured a low-clearance undercarriage. Its main legs were below the prototype's center mass, with a nose leg installed under the cockpit. And although it was expected to be fitted with a 30mm GAU-8 cannon, it was not finished by the time the prototype was scheduled for testing with the Air Force. Instead, the aircraft was fitted with the smaller 20mm M61 Vulcan cannon. Finally, the YA-9 had 10 underwing hardpoints that allowed it to carry up to 16,000 pounds worth of weapons, including the Maverick air-to-ground missiles for the CAS role. The first prototype flew for the first time on May 30th, 1972, and a second one followed in late August. The test pilots claimed it had excellent handling and felt like a fighter aircraft. Northrop's YA-9 and Fairchild Republic's YA-10 were pitched against each other between October and December of 1972, through a series of rigorous tests to decide which design was superior. The tests took place at Edwards Air Force Base in California, and although Northrop's YA-9 met all the U.S. Air Force's requirements, the YA-10 was eventually chosen for production. The YA-10's unique design and its externally mounted nacelles helped reduce its signature from ground-based trackers and also increased its survivability. If one of the two external engines was lost, the aircraft still had a fighting chance, contrary to Northrop's design. Additionally, the high-mounted engines kept the intake openings from ingesting debris during attacks at low altitudes. Still, the two YA-9 prototypes were sent to NASA for testing before being officially retired. The Lycoming engines were then removed and used in a C-8 Buffalo airframe as part of NASA's and Boeing's Quiet Short-Haul Research Aircraft Study. The almost 6-year-long Battle of the Atlantic during World War II required the cooperation of every asset each nation had in its arsenal. In the era of the much-feared Kriegsmarine U-boats, the Allies significantly struggled while facing the enemy across naval blockades on the way to the Soviet Union and Allied territories in the Mediterranean. However, the Germans were surprised early in the battle by a peculiar aircraft that constantly tore down their powerful submarines, the Short Sunderland flying boat. The potent, versatile four-engined aircraft had a gun installation that led the Germans to dub it the Flying Porcupine. No one could have imagined that the aircraft that played a pivotal role in one of the most critical battles of the war was none other than a flying boat based on a civilian design that only turned military by accident. As United Kingdom officials realized their Air Force had no existing equivalent to the new American Sikorsky S-42 flying boat or the German Dornier DO-XS-23 in the early 1930s, they envisioned an aircraft with a similar performance to the brand-new Short Sarafan, albeit at a smaller scale. Then, in November of 1933, the British Air released specification R.233, calling for the development of a next-generation long-range flying boat intended to serve in a reconnaissance role over the oceans. The competition's result was another Short Brothers creation, the S-25 Short Sunderland. Named after a port city in northern England, the Sunderland was developed in tandem with the civilian S-23 Empire flying boat, and was specifically designed to conform to the British Air Ministry's requirements. While the aircraft shared several similarities with the Empire, it featured a more advanced aerodynamic hull for improved pilot vision, as well as an extensive array of offensive and defensive armaments, including aerial mines, bombs, depth charges, and machine gun turrets. The Short Sunderland was also fitted with detection equipment for combat operations, including radar units and searchlights. As a flying boat, the Short Sunderland had special beaching wheels that were often moored to a buoy. Supplies, fuel, and ammunition were brought by ships, and the model required careful maintenance to avoid damaging the hull. The fuselage's interior was divided into two individual decks, with the lower one containing 6 bunks, a pressure stove, a machine shop for in-flight repairs, and other living facilities. The aircraft was initially intended to have a crew of 7, but could sometimes carry more than 11, depending on the mission. And while easy to fly, the pilot had the option to use autopilot for longer flights. Also, it was designed to reach a top speed of 210 miles per hour and to have an extensive range of 2,980 miles. The model was approved on October 16, 1937, after a successful maiden flight, and the first 90 machines were built not long after. The first Royal Air Force squadron to receive their Sunderlands was equipped on June 22, 1938, with further deliveries over the next 6 months. By the time World War II broke out in September of 1939, the Royal Air Force had 4 Sunderland squadrons ready to take up the fight against Nazi Germany. The RAF Coastal Command had 40 Sunderlands in its arsenal by September of 1939. During the earlier years of World War II, the Sunderland's primary use was for tracking enemy shipping, flying long patrols over the empty seas while the crews spent their days living inside. In fact, some of the Sunderland's crews never saw a single enemy in the entire war. But although British anti-submarine efforts were quite disorganized and ineffective at first, the newly introduced Sunderland flying boat eventually proved helpful in rescuing crews from ships that had been torpedoed. As such, 2 Sunderlands rescued the entire 34-man crew of the Kensington Court merchant ship from the North Sea on September 21, 1939. As time went on, and the British sharpened their combat skills, the Sunderland was subjected to several improvements, including an upgraded nose turret with 2 7.7mm guns instead of 1, tail and dorsal turrets, gun hatches within the aft fuselage, and even additional guns placed by the crews. While they lacked range and hitting power, the Sunderlands had a fair number of weapons and was a well-built machine that proved hard to destroy. On April 3, 1940, a Sunderland operating off Norway was attacked by a formation of 6 German Junkers Ju-88 fighters. The Sunderland pilot managed to shoot one down and damage another, forcing it to land and drive off the rest. After the incident, the Germans nicknamed the type Fliegende Stachelschweine, or the Flying Porcupine. In response to all the Sunderland attacks, the Germans fitted some of their U-boats with up to 2 37mm and twin quad flak guns to fire back at their attackers. The first unassisted attack carried out by a Sunderland against a German U-boat occurred on July 17, 1940. Moreover, it's estimated that the type might have sunk as many as 26 German U-boats. As the Allies looked for U-boats, the Sunderlands carried 8 depth charges and would patrol the approaches or fly convoy protection missions. Both missions were often combined, and the Sunderlands met the convoys deep in the ocean. Upon sighting a U-boat, the Sunderland crews would try to engage it before it submerged back into the water, detonating depth charges that were set to explode at a depth up to 30 feet. Still, the Sunderland began to show its claws as British anti-submarine measures improved with more experience on the battlefield. Nevertheless, the type played a vital role in the Allied effort during the global conflict by countering the threat posed by the German U-boats during the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of the war. It also became one of the most powerful and widely used flying boats of World War II, and in addition to the Royal Air Force, the type was also used by other allies, such as New Zealand, Australia, Canada, South Africa, France, Norway, and Portugal. As more modern weapons were fitted into the flying boat, the aircraft became more effective in combat. However, they were also the reason behind one accidental friendly attack. In 1939, a 100-pound anti-submarine bomb was dropped from a Sunderland, hitting the British submarine Snapper. While the fraternal bomb caused slight damage, other bombs reportedly bounced up and hit their launch aircraft. In response, the ineffective weapons were replaced by Torpex-filled depth charges that would sink to a determined depth and explode afterward, thus eliminating the bounce-back effect and the subsequent shockwave that propagated through the water. The Sunderland flying boats also proved themselves in the Mediterranean theater, where one of them performed a reconnaissance mission to observe the approaching Italian fleet at anchor in Taranto, right before the famous Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm Strike torpedo attack on November 11, 1940. The aircraft also performed many successful evacuations during the German invasion of Crete in the spring of 1941, and that same year, the flying boat was fitted with a Mark II anti-surface vessel radar. As it flew low over the waves to prevent attacks from below, Sunderland was not an easy target, and its crews were able to defend themselves with impressive ease. Nevertheless, the type's most significant weakness, in addition to its slow speed, was its range, which was not enough to close the mid-Atlantic gap. As such, the Sunderland sometimes operated outside the scope of Allied fighters that could protect them, and was thus vulnerable to enemy fighter attacks. Late in the war, when the U-boats were armed with flak and had nothing to lose, the German craft would zigzag on the surface. In response, the flying boats were fitted with 4 fixed forward-firing guns. While the Sunderland could suppress flak with its nose turret guns to an extent, the U-boat's guns had an undeniably superior range, hitting power, and accuracy. Still, the confrontations between the German U-boats and the Sunderland flying boats became extremely dangerous for both parties, often with fatal results. The Sunderlands from the RAF Coastal Command continued to perform submarine patrols until June 3, 1945, weeks after the war in the European theater ended. The use of the Sunderlands saw a steep decline in the post-war era. In fact, many of the models built at Belfast were taken out to sea and simply scuttled, as they were deemed useless. During the 1948 and 1949 airlift, in which the Soviet Union blocked the Western Allies' sea and land access sectors to Berlin under Western control, 10 Sunderlands were used to transport supplies to the isolated city by landing on the Havel River and flying over 2,000 sorties. Then, beginning in 1950, several Sunderlands served during the Korean War. The 88th, 305th, and 209th Squadrons shared the operations equally, with a rotation of 3 or 4 aircraft with crews based at Iwakuni in southwest Japan. The missions lasted up to 13 hours and were flown daily during the conflict and in the post-war armistice period that lasted until late 1954. The RAF continued to use the Sunderland in a military capacity until 1959. The following year, the French Navy, which had acquired their models in 1943, retired the last remaining examples in military use within the Northern Hemisphere. However, there was still a need for it in the Far East, where largely developed runways were less prevalent. As such, the short Sunderland served with the Royal Air Force Far East Air Force in Singapore until 1959, and with the Royal New Zealand Air Force's No. 5 Squadron until 1967. Ultimately, a total of 749 short Sunderland models were built during its 10-year production run, leaving a strong mark on the outcome of the war and the battle against the dreaded German U-boats. The Douglas A-26 Invader was the only American bomber to fly missions in 3 different major wars. It was also the last propeller-driven twin-engine bomber produced for the U.S. Air Force. The legendary aircraft was a twin-engine light bomber ground attack vehicle, able to carry an extensive bomb load and a generous range of guns. Different versions would serve in all kinds of missions, whether in combat or reconnaissance operations. The Invaders were designed and built by the Douglas Aircraft Company during World War II. They then served in several Cold War conflicts, as well as in Korea, Vietnam, and Southeast Asia until 1969. Their last flight outside official military missions was in 1994, but after 21 years of restoration work, a few of them recently took to the skies as part of the commemorative Air Force fleet, proving that the Invaders still have much more to give. The Douglas A-26 Invader was the planned successor of the A-20 Havoc, one of the most widely operated aircraft by the Allies in World War II. After a redesignation from A-26 to B-26 from 1948 to 1965, he was often confused with the Martin B-26 Marauder. But the Marauder first flew almost 2 years before the Invader. However, both models were powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP 18-cylinder double-row radial engine, commonly used at the time. The Invader's airframe employed an innovative NACA 65-215 laminar flow airfoil wing, developed by aerodynamicist A.M.O. Smith and designed by Ed Heinemann, Robert Donovan, and Ted Smith. On July 10, 1942, the prototype XA-26 flew for the first time in California and showed excellent performance and handling. Minor problems with the engine cooling required cowling changes and the elimination of propeller spinners in production aircraft. Recurrent collapses during testing further needed reinforcements in the nose landing gear. 2 configurations were developed for the early version. The A-26B had an all-purpose nose that could be fitted with 6 and later 8 50-caliber machine guns, or 20 or 37mm autocannons. In contrast, the A-26C was equipped with a glass bombardier nose for medium-altitude precision bombing, and 2 fixed M2 nose guns were swapped for underwing or internal wing guns. A total of 1,570 aircraft had been produced, when a modification added 3 guns in each wing, and the 8-nose was developed, increasing the armament to 14 50-caliber machine guns in some models. In addition, the noses in the B and C models were interchangeable. The first 820 production aircraft featured a flat-topped canopy, which was improved for visibility with a clamshell-style canopy. Besides the pilot, a second crew member would serve as navigator and gun loader. The nose gun in the A-26B would be operated by the pilot, while in the A-26C, the second crew member would act as the navigator and bombardier, relocating to the nose for bombardment. A jump seat accommodated a third crew member behind the navigator's seat. This post controlled the dorsal and ventral gun turrets remotely via a novel and complex dual-ended periscope. This device took a long time to develop and caused several production delays. It consisted of a vertical column with transversing, elevating, and depressing periscope with sights on each end. A mirror in the center seamlessly flipped to show either the upper or lower views. The gunner would sit facing backward and gaze into a binocular periscope sight embedded on the column, while controlling the guns with handles on both sides. The guns aimed approximately in the same direction as the periscope and automatically transferred between the upper and lower turrets as needed. Douglas delivered the A-26B to the U.S. Army Air Forces in September of 1943. The Invader first saw action with the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific Theater in June of 1944. Its first mission consisted of retrieving Japanese-occupied islands in Indonesia. The Grim Reapers of the 3rd Bomb Group's 13th Squadron evaluated 4 invaders and detected a hindering in the downward view, partially covered by the engines. This issue rendered the A-26B unsuitable for ground support. General George Kinney, commander of the Far East Air Forces, declared, quote, "We do not want the A-26 under any circumstances as a replacement for anything." Nevertheless, the aircraft flew several missions up to August 1945, some of them in composite flights with its predecessor, the A-20 Havoc, with the 319th Bomb Group and the original 3rd Bomb Group. At the same time, a second round of combat tests took place in Europe, where the Invader was better received. A model arrived in September of 1944 with the 9th Air Force. 18 aircraft were initially assigned to the 553rd Squadron at the 386th Bomb Group, and after 8 missions, none were lost. The 9th subsequently replaced its A-20s and Martin B-26s with the new A-26 Invader. The 416th and 409th were among the first bombardment groups to also convert to the Invader. By November of 1944, they went into combat with the recently operational A-26B, but there was a shortage of the A-26C glass-nosed version. Hence, they had to fly combined missions with the A-20 Havoc until the deliveries caught up. Their missions were mostly successful. The Invader was primarily used in bombing and strafing, but it also executed tactical reconnaissance and night interdiction missions until the end of the war. By then, the 9th Air Force had performed 11,567 missions and lost 67 aircraft overall. After the independent establishment of the U.S. Air Force in 1947, the model was redesignated to B-26. Its attack configuration was left behind, and the Martin B-26 Marauder had retired. An RB-26 reconnaissance version was also designed and remained in service until 1950. The A-26 was among the few wartime aircraft models still in service during the post-war in the U.S. Air Force. The B-26s of the 3rd Bombardment Group were among the first U.S. Air Force aircraft that participated in the Korean War. Operating from southern Japan, they carried out missions over South Korea and even executed the first bombing in North Korea on June 29, 1950. By November, the 452nd Bombardment Wing flew its first missions from Itazuke, Japan, providing daylight support, while the 3rd Bomb Wing flew night missions. Besides the B-26 standard version, modified models for supporting roles in weather observation and reconnaissance missions were critical to the American forces. The 452nd eventually had to move to the Miho Air Base on the west coast of Honshu because of the Chinese intervention. In 1951, their intruding missions continued from Pusan East Air Base. By June, the 3rd would cover the western half of the country, while the 452nd targeted the east at night. These actions earned both bomb groups 2-unit citations and the Korean Presidential Citation. The last bombing mission in the area, 24 minutes before the armistice took effect on June 27, 1953, was executed by Douglas B-26 Invaders. They ultimately received credit for 8 campaigns, in which the B-26s destroyed 38,500 vehicles, 406 locomotives, 3,700 railway trucks, and 7 aircraft on the ground. However, the Invaders' most notable feat was accomplished by Captain John S. Walmsley, Jr. On September 14, 1951, Walmsley attacked a supply train, but all of his guns simultaneously jammed. The captain then illuminated the area with a searchlight, enabling his wingmen to destroy the train. He was eventually shot down and bestowed the Medal of Honor posthumously. The first B-26s arrived in Thailand in 1960 and were operated by the CIA. During Operation Mill Pond, air support was provided to the Royal Lao government to fight the Communist Lao People's Liberation Army. The aircraft were then deployed to South Vietnam and operated under Project Farmgate, the American effort in South Asia, before the overt entry of U.S. forces into the battle. During the early phase of the Vietnam War, B-26Bs and B-26Cs flew along reconnaissance RB-26Cs, but in a combat capacity. After 2 accidents related to wing spar fatigue, the B-26 was withdrawn from service in 1964 and replaced by the Douglas A-1 Skyraider. The On-Mark Engineering Company was then tasked to improve the Invader for counterinsurgency missions, and the B-26K made its first production flight in May of 1964. Upgrades included improved engines, propellers, brakes, wings, and fuel tanks for use by the 609th Special Operations Squadron. In total, 40 Invaders were converted. However, in May of 1966, The Invader was again redesignated to A-26A due to political reasons. Thailand did not allow US bombers into its mainland, so the code returned to A for attack and was used to disrupt supply lines along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Douglas built a total of 2,503 A-26 and B-26 Invaders. The Invader underwent many redesignations during its lifetime, and the A-26A stayed in service throughout the late 1960s, performing active-duty special operations. The U.S. Navy also purchased Invaders for utility squadrons, target towing, and general utility, and the aircraft was also used by the CIA for covert operations. During the seaborne Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in 1961, B-26s flying with the Fuerza Aérea de Liberación, FAL, attacked 3 Cuban government-held airfields controlled by the Fuerza Aérea Revolucionaria, or FAR. The Douglas Invader performed many different roles around the world. It took part in the Congo crisis, and other air forces such as the French and the Portuguese joined them to their ranks. The last active Invader in U.S. military service was assigned to the Air National Guard and retired from military service in 1972. It was then donated to the National Air and Space Museum. But in November of 2020, a third Invader from the Commemorative Air Force flew its first flights after a restoration that took over 2 decades. SH-A26 support group leader James Dudnelli noted that, quote, "We are planning on touring with the aircraft and doing air shows. However, we can legally operate the aircraft to raise funding, and that's what we'll be doing." A witness recounted that 2 men wearing dark shades during an air show were intrigued by the aircraft and asked what its original color used to be. When they learned the Invader used to be white with gray trim, one of them exclaimed, quote, "My God, it's the Gray Ghost. We chased that sucker up and down the Gulf Coast. Never could catch him. He'd drop down on the deck and throttle the engines up and leave us standing there." The 2 gentlemen were Drug Enforcement Administration agents. "30 years before achieving the pinnacle of helicopter technology with the design of the legendary AH-64 Apache, the Hughes Aircraft Company ventured into the emerging rotor aircraft industry for the first time by attempting to develop a colossal helicopter like the world had never seen before. As the Hughes XH-17 prototype prepared for its maiden flight on October 23, 1952, pilot Gale Moore was visibly anxious. He was about to test the aircraft with the most oversized rotor in the world, with a diameter of 130 feet. The pilot knew that despite the engineering efforts, the massive hollow rotor blades were under tremendous strain, and they could snap at any moment during takeoff. Media crews from around the country gathered to witness the event, and even Howard Hughes himself was first in line. Suddenly, the jet engines ignited ferociously, and flames shot from the ends of the rotor blades, with the Los Angeles Times later reporting, quote, "The whoosh whoosh of the whirring blades sounded like hundreds of artillery shells in flight. You could hear it 7 or 8 miles away." What happened next would be forever recorded in the history of aviation. The XH-17 was an ambitious project requested by the U.S. Air Force. The idea was to create a powerful aerial crane capable of lifting large amounts of supplies and even artillery units across bridges, swamps, and mountains for America's war efforts around the globe. At the time, there was not a single helicopter capable of lifting such significant cargo, with the primitive Bell 47 aerial cranes only able to lift a few hundred pounds of supplies. The monumental task was undertaken by Kellett Autogyro Corporation. Still, as the project dragged on and the aircraft's design became ever more complex and expensive, the company realized it would not be able to complete it. The unique and ambitious propulsion system eventually left the company without funds, and Kellett was forced to try to sell the design or face bankruptcy. In a twist of fate, Howard Hughes was precisely seeking to explore rotor aircraft development and needed a worthwhile project to kickstart the helicopter division of his company. After a short period of negotiations, Hughes Aircraft bought the XH-17 design and its early propulsion prototypes for $250,000. The team at Kellett had grown very close to the project, and XH-17 lead engineer Nick Stefano recalls, quote, I can remember most of us saying, "Do something to get this Hughes guy out of the picture." Hughes had no experience with helicopters, and his company had limited experience with conventional aircraft. Still, the ambitious venture quickly gained steam, and a prototype began testing at the Hughes facilities in Culver City, California in 1952. The development of a first fly-ready prototype was a huge undertaking, as the sheer size of the rotor was a seemingly insurmountable obstacle. Stefano remembers, quote, "A 130-foot diameter rotor at the time was just inconceivable." To accelerate the construction of the daring rotorcraft prototype, parts of the XH-17 were scavenged from other aircraft. The front wheels came from a B-25 Mitchell, the rear wheels from a C-54 Skymaster, the fuel tank from a B-29 Superfortress, the cockpit from a Waco CG-15, and the tail rotor from a Sikorsky H-19. The Hughes XH-17 Sky Crane was designed with an exceptional propulsion system to carry loads surpassing 50,000 pounds. It was the first aircraft to use it, and if it performed adequately, a new generation of helicopters would adopt the technology to carry even larger loads. The propulsion system was unique because the two General Electric J35 turbojet engines were used to deliver bleed air up through the rotor hub. Meanwhile, the blades were hollow but colossal in size, with a joint diameter of 130 feet. As such, the hot, compressed air expelled by the engines traveled through the blades to tip jets where fuel was injected. Moreover, due to the blade's massive dimensions, the main rotor turned at a peaceful 88 revolutions per minute during flight, less than half the speed of a typical helicopter rotor speed. Also, the rotor was driven at the tips rather than the hub, so little torque compensation was needed due to friction in the main rotor bearing. Thus, the XH-17 had a tiny tail rotor that contrasted with its main one, and along with the wide assortment of aircraft parts, the finished prototype had a distinct makeshift appearance that differed significantly from other experimental aircraft developed during the 1950s and 1960s. The testing phase for the Sky Crane lasted almost 3 years. During that time, only one prototype was available, as the massive size of the craft made it impossible to transport, store, and test more than a single unit. The XH-17 was tested following a slow and steady procedure, as many risks were involved due to the propulsion system's nature and the rotor's size. For starters, no other helicopter had ever been fitted with such long rotor blades, and there was no precedent to guarantee they would hold during long flights. Also, the blades were hollow and each measured close to 20 meters in length, which meant they had a short service life and could actually snap at any moment during the trials. The issue of who would pilot the perilous aircraft was also of great importance to Hughes. Until that date, they had no helicopter division and thus no helicopter pilots, much less one who would be qualified to operate the rotorcraft with the most oversized rotor in history. Fortunately, Gail Moore stepped up to the task. The pilot had joined Los Angeles Airways in 1948 to fly Sikorsky S-51 helicopters, and after becoming a prominent helicopter pilot, he began to seek a more significant challenge. Moore then joined Hughes Aircraft, just as the corporation started to venture into the field of helicopters, making him the ideal candidate to fly the massive Sky Crane. The aircraft's first ever flight took place on September 16, 1952, and it was just a short hover, with the Sky Crane only rising about a foot above the ground. Still, the experience was exhilarating. Moore slowly pulled collective pitch, and the craft lurched into the air almost violently. He then lowered the pitch lever and raised it again without soothing the irregular movements before settling on the ground with a solid thud. The pilot would later say, quote, "The flight was like riding a pogo stick in a sitting position. Up, down, up, down." Flight analysis of the groundbreaking test revealed that the Sky Crane's controls were more sensitive than those of the S-51. Thus, the pilot would need to try a whole new approach to flying. By October 23, 1952, Moore had honed his XH-17 piloting skills, and Hughes was ready to show the world how the massive Sky Crane worked. The transcendental moment took place at the Hughes facilities in Culver City, California, The event was a historical occurrence, as it not only featured the largest rotor in any aircraft, but also signaled the official birth of the Hughes Aircraft Helicopter Division. The businessman himself was there, anxious to see the future of his enterprise take flight. Surrounded by news crews from media chains across America, the XH-17 was ready to launch before the eyes of the nation. And despite his previous experience, Gale Moore was suddenly concerned about his abilities as a test pilot. He'd been a helicopter pilot for just a few years, and the massive media presence made him self-conscious. Years later, he would talk about his experience that day. Quote, "I felt very conspicuous as I stepped out of my car. I hoped this wouldn't be the day we made any big mistakes." Howard Hughes himself would be in the audience. I had to admit to a little bit of stage fright. As the blade-tipped jet engines on the helicopter flared up, and a burst of flames was propelled from the ends of the rotor blades, the most remarkable rotor aircraft in history was ignited, and the noise it made was so deafening that it could be heard miles away. Military officials would compare the sound to the continuous shelling of an artillery barrage. As Hughes watched meticulously, Moore made a calculated vertical ascent. Gone were the pogo-like movements of the previous test, as the pilot had now mastered the helicopter's controls. The sky crane hovered around the airfield for approximately 10 minutes, then dashed forward and backward to end the spectacle by making a series of full circles in different directions. The public display was a tremendous success, and although the sky crane project would be cancelled soon after the event, the objective was achieved. Hughes Aircraft had successfully begun its helicopter enterprise, while also proving that its particular propulsion system worked. The Hughes XH-17 became the basis for the XH-28, another aerial crane developed by Hughes, and it eventually became the starting point for many large helicopters of the modern era. Hughes would also become a household name in rotorcraft technology, and his company's efforts would culminate decades later after designing the most capable attack helicopter in the world, the AH-64 Apache. To this day, the XH-17 is considered the aircraft with the largest rotor diameter to have successfully taken to the skies. A handful of elite airmen from the United States Air Force's 596th Bomb Squadron were awoken by the sound of a blaring alert siren on the dawn of January 16, 1991. After months of training for a highly secretive mission they were not even fully informed about, the mysterious endeavor suddenly became real. As a result of the Iraqi leadership's August 1990 invasion of Kuwait, 57 aviators aboard 7 B-52 Shadow Fortresses, carrying a highly secretive new American weapon, were about to embark on the longest aerial sortie ever conducted to that day. It was dark, rainy, and with high winds when Operation Senior Surprise was launched, and it would take exhaustive efforts to keep the iconic B-52s aloft. After 15 hours of arduous conditions above the Atlantic and into the Middle East, the airmen now faced an even more daunting challenge: to deploy the new weapon accurately and hit all their desired targets. In the wake of Operation El Dorado Canyon during the April 1986 raid on Libya, a new weapon was created to compensate for the mission's shortcomings. While the assault on military facilities and terrorist training camps successfully deterred terrorist action for several years, the AGM-86B nuclear-armed cruise missile, the service's only standoff weapon, was less than efficient. The missile was not easily deployed and had caused the loss of an F-111 and its crew. Moreover, some errant bombs even injured innocent civilians, or worse. As such, top Pentagon officials instructed the Air Force developers to improve the design, upgrading the weapon's precision to a surgical level. To get with the times, the nuclear-tipped AGM-86B cruise missile was demoted into a conventional air-launched cruise missile, or CALCM. After removing the weapon's W-80 nuclear warheads and the terrain contour-matching guidance systems, the new AGM-86C version now had 1,000-pound conventional blast fragmentation warheads, albeit with twice the punch. This new missile was also the first to be installed with a Global Positioning System satellite receiver, promising unprecedented accuracy. As a result, the weapon had to be kept secret. For 3 years, more than 36 CALCMs waited in their storage igloos at Barksdale Air Base until a worthy threat emerged. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi forces rolled into Kuwait. At the time, the U.S. forces in the area were not up to the task of repelling an expected invasion of Saudi Arabia, and Iraq was the strongest military power across the Persian Gulf, with no less than 5,500 main battle tanks, 3,700 field artillery guns, and 10,000 armored vehicles. Furthermore, the Iraqi forces had access to 160 helicopters and 50 combat divisions with 7 corps. In contrast, the Air Force had up to 600 modern combat aircraft, including French Mirage F-1s, Soviet MiG-29s, and Su-24s, piloted by seasoned crews. As for mobile and static air defense, the Iraqi operated about 1,000 to 1,500 surface-to-air launchers, not counting their hundreds of anti-aircraft guns. The United Nations Big Five nations subsequently delivered an ultimatum to Saddam Hussein. Either he pulled his troops out of Kuwait by January 15th, or they would face military action. Realizing their ground forces in the region were virtually non-existent, the American High Command began planning an aerial response that would at least slow down the invaders, or even stop them. Within hours of the invasion, the 2nd Bomb Wing at Barksdale Air Force Base in Bossier City, Louisiana, and Lieutenant Colonel J. Beard from the 596th Bomb Squadron received orders to prepare for a top-secret mission involving their precious and confidential weapons. The new weapon systems offered a chance for the United States to make a strong political statement rather than deal a crippling blow and potentially hurt innocent civilians. By August of 1990, only one B-52 Stratofortress crew had flight-tested the weapon. As such, it was the only one available to operate the crucial system. In order to deliver the kind of strike the Strategic Air Command and the White House had agreed upon, more crews would be needed to be trained in how to deploy it. A few short weeks later, a select group of 15 air crews and maintainers from the 796th Bomb Squadron were introduced to the Secret Squirrels and taught how to combat and deploy the new weapon. The nickname originated so the selected few could track schedules and discuss the mission in unclassified areas. The mission, orchestrated by the Strategic Air Command, was to be a 7-aircraft, long-range B-52G Stratofortress cruise missile strike against Iraqi targets. And for it to work, the standard B-52 crew of 6 men was augmented with 1 extra pilot and 1 extra radar navigator, so the men could take turns to rest. Planning for Operation Senior Surprise had to be minute to the very last detail, and as the January 15th deadline approached, the pace quickened. The day before, all crew members were restricted to the 2nd Bomb Wing Alert Facility, where they remained as the selected 15th came and went, ignored by the Iraqi leader. Unknown to most, except for a few general officers and staff, the mission would play a significant role in the opening of the Desert Storm campaign, the beginning of the 1991 Gulf War. In the early hours of January 16th, all Operation Secret Squirrel air crews were called into a briefing room. The order was to launch the operation that day. At the time, the risks of venturing into the Middle Eastern skies were not fully known, and the crews were suddenly faced with the possibility of not coming back. During that night, the winds were high, and mild rain had fallen for hours. Even so, Lieutenant General E.G. Buck Schuler, commander of the 8th Air Force, was confident in the capabilities of his hand-selected crews. Addressing the Secret Squirrels, Schuler described the upcoming mission and its potential challenges, comparing its importance to the 1942 Doolittle raids, the first air operation to strike the Japanese archipelago, including Tokyo. With their leader's words of encouragement, the airmen's training kicked in, and their fears turned into focus. After receiving a go order at 3 a.m, mission leader Lieutenant Colonel Beard notified the crews to launch the operation. Exactly 12 hours before Operation Desert Storm, one after another, the 7 B-52s lumbered down the Louisiana runway, taking off and disappearing from view, beginning the 14,000-mile trek into the Middle East. Flying over the Atlantic Ocean, the bombers then headed toward their first aerial refueling rendezvous with KC-135 Stratotankers somewhere near the Azores archipelago in Portugal. Aboard the lead plane, Doom 31, Colonel Beard called upon the aircraft commanders to check in, getting an audio confirmation from 5 of the 6 other bombers, all except Doom 34. A few minutes into the call for confirmation, the crew aboard Doom 34 announced they had shut down an engine due to fluctuating oil pressure during takeoff. However, the aircrew was determined to continue with the operation, as it had been decided during planning that a B-52 could finish the mission with only 6 engines. Colonel Beard obliged. After refueling once more over the Mediterranean Sea, with tankers out of Morón Air Base in Spain, the Stratofortress bombers crossed the Red Sea with their lights out and in radio silence, and ventured into the Arabian Desert. Upon entering Saudi airspace, the crews armed the missiles and started their run to the launch point. Then, about 100 miles south of the border in the far western part of Saudi Arabia, 4 missiles showed software problems and couldn't be launched, as the men were prohibited from launching any faulty weapons to avoid collateral damage. Firing the operative cruise missiles took only 10 minutes, and aimed at 8 targets, including power plants in Mosul and a telephone exchange in Basra. "15 hours after the initial takeoff, the bombers turned west for their next refueling, which the crews managed to do despite bad weather and low visibility. With strong headwinds, the aircrews with retained missiles or malfunctioning engines experienced increased drag, and some of the aircraft required additional refueling for the flight back to Barksdale. The mission was considered a success, and all the aircraft and crew members returned home safely. In 35 hours and 24 minutes, the fleet of B-52s covered 14,000 miles all the way to the Middle East and back, performing the longest combat sortie in aviation history, and the only mission launched directly from the continental United States. Even so, the highly secretive mission was to remain classified for an entire year. It wasn't until the first anniversary of the raid that the aircrews were finally presented with air, achievement, and commendation medals for their efforts. A few months later, the organization responsible for command and control of the United States strategic bomber and intercontinental ballistic missile components would be deactivated, making Operation Senior Surprise one of the final large-scale missions of the Strategic Air Command. Ultimately, the operation achieved between 85 and 91% of its objectives, far surpassing the original expectations. Admittedly, CALCMs had never before been volley-launched or operated under real-world conditions with the new GPS technology. As Operation Desert Storm kicked off, the B-52s continued playing a critical role throughout the entire campaign. By the end, roughly 70 such aircraft had covered 1,741 missions, totaling 15,269 combat hours and 27,000 tons of munitions dropped. Meanwhile, the AGM-86C CALCM is still in use and ready to engage targets anywhere in the world when called upon. However, Secret Squirrel was the only mission of its kind during Operation Desert Storm. Because of the intensity of the blow and the degree of destruction that night, subsequent similar missions were rendered unnecessary. The American military's ability to deploy its troops anywhere in the world on short notice is one of the many reasons that make it the most powerful army in the world. When talking about these grandiose missions, large cargo aircraft such as the Lockheed C-5 Galaxy or the Boeing C-17 Globemaster III typically come to mind. But apart from these larger-than-life planes, a secret fleet of small Swiss planes have also become fundamental for these dangerous operations. Their role is even more critical as the US continues its fight against terrorism. The Swiss plane's name is the U-28, and since June 2019, it has an official nickname, Draco, the Latin word for dragon, and a constellation in the far northern sky. Since their introduction almost 15 years ago, these modest planes have become an increasingly important component of U.S. counterterrorism operations, with intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions all over the world. Although small, the roar of the Draco is mighty. In October 2005, the Air Force's 319 Special Operations Squadron received a new aircraft. It was the small but mighty U-28A, a single-engine turboprop passenger and cargo aircraft. After flying its first mission in 2006, 4 U-28A became part of the 319th Squadron. As of 2020, the Air Force's U-28 fleet consists of 28 aircraft in total. The U-28 is the military version of the Swiss-made Pilatus PC-12 and was initially purchased at a unit price of $3.5 million. The U in its designation stands for utilitarian. The plane has been popular with commercial users from all over the world since 1991. The U-28 is a relatively cheap aircraft and runs for about $500 per flight hour. It carries up to 9 passengers and cargo from a remote airstrip to another hub 1,500 miles away, flying well above terrain at a cruising speed of 310 miles per hour. The plane can successfully take off in 2,450 feet and land in 3,050. It is excellent at landing on dirt and grass strips, making it handy for Middle East missions. Since the beginning, the United States Special Operations Command and the Air Force Special Operations Command saw a lot of potential in the U-28. According to the Air Force Special Operations Command's Captain Kirsten K. Duncan, quote, "These aircraft give us the flexibility to move smaller amounts of people and cargo to remote or austere airfields that our larger aircraft could not use." The exact intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities of the U-28 are classified. Not all of the 28 U-28 share the same configuration and payload, and different iterations of the aircraft have appeared throughout the years. Although quite similar to the airplane's civilian version in terms of basic design, most of the U-28A models carry state-of-the-art equipment. Within the last decade, the Air Force Special Operations Command has upgraded several of their U-28s with a secretive new configuration known as EQ+. According to Pentagon budget documents, this update includes a sensor turret, electro-optical and high-definition infrared cameras, and intelligence systems capable of geolocating and monitoring hostile communications. This equipment also allows the aircraft to fly at higher altitudes. Most importantly, it enables it to operate at a further distance from its target, which reduces risks and makes it less likely to be spotted by the subject of interest. Despite being a relatively small aircraft, all U-28s have avant-garde communications and data-sharing software. This allows the crew to send intel they gather from their missions to their command centers in real time. Like other Special Ops aircraft, the U-28s keep such a low profile and appear so similar to their civilian version that they often go unnoticed during their clandestine missions. To maintain such camouflage, these planes tend to fly with civilian-style paint colors, rather than the standard Air Force Special Operations Command gray color scheme. Since the exact details about the missions completed over the years by the U-28 aren't public information, the internet is rife with speculation and theories. According to most of them, the U-28 is precisely what its U prefix stands for, a utility aircraft. The U-28's extended list of capabilities, mixed with its low operating cost and discreet design, have made it ideal for small counterterrorism missions worldwide. Since its initial deployment in 2006, the U-28 has been essential in ISR, which stands for Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance missions. The mission's primary objective is to bring support in humanitarian, search and rescue, conventional, and special operations missions, such as pursuing rebel pickups in deserted areas and eavesdropping on suspicious radio communications. An unofficial report has stated that the U-28 fleet had accumulated over 500,000 flight hours. This aircraft has completed successful missions all across the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Africa, and is said to be operated from small airstrips in Uganda, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and mostly Burkina Faso. Between 2011 and 2012, the 318th Squadron flew a series of sorties in the Philippines as part of Operation Enduring Freedom Philippines. In it, U.S. special operators worked with Filipino security agents in the battle against Abu Sayyaf, an Islamist terrorist group, as well as Jamaah Islamiyah, a regional Islamist terrorist organization. Both groups have ties to Al-Qaeda, who have committed crimes against civilians, mostly foreigners, throughout the country. Departing from their bases in Germany, U-28 performed similar sorties across Europe and Africa. In these missions, the planes flew 133 sorties and moved just over 27,000 pounds of cargo. Most of these missions were to or from the Entebbe International Airport in Uganda. This was the American mission's hub, helping African troops in 4 countries to eradicate the Lord's Resistance Army rebel group and a tireless effort to apprehend its infamous leader, Joseph Kony. For over 20 years, Kony and his organization had terrorized Central Africa, abducting hundreds of children to fight as child soldiers or child trafficking. The aircraft also flew sorties in Latin America from Sotocano Air Base in Honduras. Although it isn't clear what mission the aircraft supported in the region, the planes likely moved cargo and personnel around as part of both counter-drug and counter-terrorism operations. Although the U-28 has completed dozens of successful sorties, not all crews have been as lucky. In 2017, it was reported that a U-28 aircraft sustained an accident near Clovis Municipal Airport in New Mexico. The pilot, co-pilot, and a combat systems officer were lost upon impact. The crash, which happened on March 14th, occurred during a training sortie. A thorough investigation concluded that the crew lost control of the aircraft when it entered a stall at low altitude during an emergency landing procedure. There were no indications of a significant mechanical malfunction. The investigation also inferred that the crew delayed the actions that were necessary to prevent the accident. Lost in the tragedy were pilot Captain Andrew Becker, Combat Systems Officer Captain Kenneth Dalga, and co-pilot First Lieutenant Frederick Deliker. After more than a decade of completed missions, the U-28 finally received an official nickname. In June 2019, the Air Force Special Operations Command publicly announced that the aircraft would be known as Draco. In Latin, the word Draco means dragon. It is also a large constellation in the far northern sky. Not long after the official announcement, many Air Force officials commented on how much they and the Special Ops team treasure the Draco. Colonel Andrew Jett, 492nd Special Operations Wing Commander and former Draco pilot, commented, quote, "Our partners may not have known the personal names of the crew members, but they always know Draco. There's a tremendous amount of recognition and respect when a crew member identifies him or herself as being a member of Draco. I'm thrilled about the exceptional reputation Draco has built over the 13-plus years of the program, and it's now codified as the permanent aircraft name and is something every member of Draco, past and present, can take pride in." Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Chad Anthony, commander of the 319th Special Ops Squadron, said in a statement that, quote, "The Draco has come to mean unparalleled special operations intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance support, especially to the men and women on the ground in the line of fire. Aircrew and special operators who have flown and worked with the Pilatus U-28A have known it as Draco since its first combat deployment in June 2006. Air Force Colonel Robert Masitis said that he was happy the U-28 had gotten an official nickname because the plane deserved it. He stated, quote, "I'm glad to see we're bringing this initiative to fruition after all this time, as the U-28 has become so much more than the single-engine, nondescript utility aircraft we brought into the service over a decade ago." The Air Force declared that the plane's new nickname had been approved in May 2019, but plans to officially name it date back to as far as 2010. The United States isn't the only country with a small plane dedicated to conducting long-range intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance special operations. Other countries such as Finland, Switzerland, and Bulgaria have their own variant of the Pilatus PC-12, which conducts similar missions. The Draco has proven itself to be worthy of such a long history in U.S. military service. It has excellent performance, and it's a very adaptable plane. On top of everything, it's also cheap to maintain and is very discreet. It comes as no surprise that the aircraft has been used for over a decade. There's no doubt that the newly christened Draco will keep watch and perform hundreds more special ops missions worldwide for years to come. In the spring of 1945, at a forward airfield in Belgium, Allied ground crews worked feverishly to prepare the 449th Bombardment Squadron for a new mission. Amongst all the B-26 Marauders, one stood out from the rest, peppered with over 1,000 patches covering bullet holes, shrapnel, and anti-aircraft shells. This twin-engine bomber was better known around the 449th as Flak Bait. This would be the 200th mission for the battle-worn B-26, and many wondered how it could still fly. Leading the attack that day was Colonel John Samuel, the commanding officer of the 322nd Bombardment Group, who had handpicked this aircraft as his leading flagship for the assault against Nazi targets in Germany. As co-pilot, Captain Samuel's mission was clear: ensure the squadron's success and a triumphant return from the assault on German defenses, hoping the aircraft's nickname wouldn't finally catch up to it. In March 1939, with the war against Nazi Germany more and more likely, the United States Army Air Corps published requirements for a new twin-engine medium bomber. Proposals poured in from Douglas, Stearman, and North American, but it was Glenn L. Martin Company's proposal, Model 179, designed by 26-year-old aeronautical engineer Peyton M. Magruder, that delivered the most outstanding submission. That August, Martin was issued a contract for 201 units of this model, to be referred to as B-26 Marauders. Since the aircraft was ordered off the drawing board, there was no prototype of this shoulder-winged monoplane with an all-metal construction. Overall, the B-26 Marauder was 58 feet 6 inches long and had a wingspan of 71 feet. The bomber's weight was 37,000 pounds and was powered by two Pratt & Whitney R2800-43 double wasp radial engines, producing up to 2,200 horsepower each, allowing it to reach a maximum speed of 285 miles per hour. Following President Franklin D. Roosevelt's famous call for 50,000 aircraft in 1940, the Marauder order was increased to 990 aircraft, even though the model had yet to fly. When it finally did, on November 25, 1940, with Martin test pilot William K. Ebel at the controls, the Army Air Corps accepted it into operational service soon after, on February 8, 1941. This rapid feat led Time magazine to declare the B-26 as Martin's miracle. But there was one big problem with this aircraft that would lead to a permanent reputation, despite numerous attempts to solve it. Due to the Marauder's small wings and high loading, the B-26 had a relatively high landing speed of 120 to 135 miles per hour, and a stall speed also around 120. These characteristics made the aircraft challenging to fly, especially for inexperienced pilots in training. While there were only 2 major accidents in the bomber's first year of use, 1941, these numbers radically increased as the United States Army Air Forces significantly expanded after America entered World War II. When 15 models crashed over 30 days at MacDill Field in Florida, and 13 more crashed in a little over a year, crews were soon giving the aircraft nicknames such as Widowmaker and Flying Coffin, and christening it with the saying, "one a day in Tampa Bay." These numerous incidents led to a lousy prestige that drove the B-26s into congressional scrutiny. In 1942, then Missouri Senator Harry S. Truman, as chairman of the Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program, asked Martin's representatives why so many B-26 Marauders had crashed or had issues. After an investigation, it was decided that the wings were too short. Truman sternly replied that if such negligence continued, the contract would be canceled. Ensuring it wasn't, Martin added 6 feet to the wingspan with upgraded engines, more armor, and heavier guns. Throughout the war, Martin continuously confirmed the aircraft was easier and easier to fly. Still, the landing and stall speeds remained high, and the aircraft required extra training. But even while those problems were being resolved, B-26 Marauders immediately went into combat after America's entry into World War II. The first B-26s arrived in the Pacific in February 1941 as a replacement for the Douglas B-18 Bolo. With 2 bomb bays fitted mid-fuselage, while there was a maximum capability of carrying up to 5,800 pounds of bombs, in practice such a load reduced range too much. To fix this, the aft bomb bay, instead of munition, was usually fitted with additional fuel tanks. Armament included 11 12.7mm machine guns in fixed, forward-firing nose and waist mounts, and in powered dorsal and tail turrets. Later models were armed with 11 M2 Browning machine guns. Early in the war, the B-26 had a shackle on the belly to drop torpedoes. 4 B-26s from the 69th Bomb Squadron, 38th Bomb Group, that was supposed to fly to Australia were sent to Midway to help defend the island in one of America's major turning points against the Japanese. On the first day of the battle, they found the Japanese carriers and dropped their torpedoes. None hit their targets. They did kill 2 sailors aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi with their machine guns and shoot down a Mitsubishi A6M0. Despite its poor reputation with many pilots, with some civilian ferry crews flat out refusing to fly B-26s, more experienced air crews found the Marauder to be a highly effective aircraft with a superb degree of crew survivability. The solution for the issues was simple. In addition to better pilot training, when approaching a landing on one engine, the pilot had to stay above 150 miles per hour on the runway. Once this procedure was adopted, accident rates dropped tremendously. While the B-26 continued its flight in the Pacific, more and more B-26s entered service and began operating in all theaters of the war. Where America fought, so did the B-26 Marauder. In November 1942, 3 B-26 bombardment groups were allocated to support the invasion of French North Africa. In Operation Torch, while they were initially used for low-level attacks against heavily defended targets, this led to heavy losses with poor results, causing them to switch to medium-level attacks. By the end of the victorious North African campaign, the 3 groups had flown 1,587 sorties, losing 80 aircraft, double the loss rate of the contemporary B-25, which also flew 70% more sorties with even fewer aircraft. Despite this, the B-26 proved to be an effective bomber in the medium-level role during the invasions of Sicily and Italy, providing much-needed aid for the various Allied advances. To the north, the B-26 Marauder arrived in Britain with the 8th Air Force in early 1943. One of the first attacks made by the bombers was an unescorted attack against a power station in the Netherlands. Still, the entire attacking force, 11 B-26s, fell victim to Luftwaffe-flown Focke-Wulf FW-190s and anti-aircraft fire. But when flying medium-altitude raids with the proper escort, the aircraft was a highly accurate bomber, used in medium-level attacks and hitting targets above 10,000 feet. Speaking of this role, Air Marshal Sir John Slessor, Deputy Commander-in-Chief of Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, once said, quote, "The astonishing accuracy of the experienced medium bomber groups, particularly the Marauders. I think that the 42nd Bombardment Group in Sardinia is probably the best day bomber unit in the world." In the lead-up to Operation Overlord, the B-26 supported ground forces during the Normandy campaign and even knocked out V-1 rocket sites. The B-26 also performed well in long-range reconnaissance roles as an anti-shipping aircraft and even in some mine-laying. But one particular aircraft in Europe would achieve extreme success. B-26 serial code 41-31173's story began in 1943 in Maryland when it was assembled at a Martin factory. That same spring, the Marauder took off across the Atlantic and headed for Rougham, England, where the 449th Bombardment Squadron, 322nd Bombardment Group of the 8th Air Force was based. There, the aircraft's new pilot, Lieutenant James J. Farrell, christened the bomber Flakbait, adapting the name of his family dog back at home, Fleabait. The aircraft flew its first bombing mission on August 16th against a German fighter base in France. While attacking coastal areas with medium bombers at low levels had worked exceptionally well in the Pacific theater, the 8th Air Force tried their luck along the European coast. All 12 B-26s used for the mission returned safely. Flakbait and her fellow Marauders flew bombing missions against fuel depots, airfields, and other targets to win air supremacy over occupied France. After several similar missions, Lieutenant Farrell realized that he had either appropriately christened the B-26 or inadvertently jinxed it. Rarely did the bomber make it back to the airfield unscathed by flak. Farrell later recalled, quote, "It was hit plenty of times, hit all the time." On one occasion, in September 1943, a Messerschmitt Bf-109 approached Flakbait and sent a 20mm shell right through the bomber's nose, striking the back of Farrell's instrument panel. While the panel exploded, wounded the bombardier, and knocked out all flight instruments, Flakbait made it back to base safely. In October 1943, the 9th Air Force assumed the role of tactical air support for the upcoming Allied invasion of Europe and transferred to England. Because of this, the 322nd, including Flakbait, became a part of the 9th Air Force. As D-Day approached, Flakbait continued to fly many missions, striking technical targets like bridges, railroad yards, and coastal artillery emplacements, reaching their 100th mission in June 1944, including 2 on June 6th in support of the invasion of Normandy. Against all odds, pilot Farrell and his crew survived their tour and returned to the United States in July 1944. Lieutenant Graydon K. Eubank took command of Flakbait for a short time, but was soon after replaced with Lieutenant Henry Bozarth. As the Allied armies finally advanced into France, the 449th and the Flakbait Marauder transferred to an airfield at Beauvais-Thiel, France. Despite the crew change, the veteran aircraft continued to live up to its reputation. As the fall approached, with the Germans in headlong retreat, Flakbait aided the march across France in August and September. For the rest of the fall, the group continued to bomb bridges, road junctions, and ordnance depots. But the Germans were not ready to give up just yet, and on December 16, 1944, the Third Reich, in one of the final attempts to capture Antwerp and choke the Allies' supply chain, sent more than 500,000 men into the Ardennes forest. During the Battle of the Bulge, Flakbait attacked road and rail bridges, used by the Nazis during their attack and eventual withdrawal the following month. On its 180th mission, Flakbait took more than 700 hits from flak fragments, but the aircraft refused to be destroyed by the Germans. The aircraft radio operator at the time, MacDonald Darnell Jr., remembered, quote, "Everybody was afraid of that damn thing, but she always got back for us." Finally, on an airfield at Le Coulot, Belgium, on March 30th, 1945, Flakbait completed mission number 200, leading the entire 322nd Bomb Group to Magdeburg, Germany, and back again on April 17th. By Germany's surrender in May of that year, Flak Bait had completed 207 missions, more than any other American bomber in World War II. In total, the Flak Bait Marauder released over 375,000 pounds of bombs, covered nearly 200,000 miles, and accumulated 725 hours of combat time. During those, the aircraft returned twice on one engine, survived a massive engine fire, had its electrical system knocked out 2 times, and on one occasion lost its hydraulic system. The B-26 Marauder took her final flight on March 18, 1946, when it made its way to an air depot in Bavaria to travel to America, where, because of its unique history, the newly formed United States Air Force transferred the B-26 to museum status. The Martin B-26 was one of the most controversial American-made combat aircraft of World War II. On a total of 4 occasions, investigation boards met to decide if the development and production of the Marauder should continue or be cancelled. But the Marauder survived all attempts to remove it from service and made many improvements to make it safer and improve its combat effectiveness. During the course of its years-long production run, 5,288 B-26s were built, with the most numerous variants being the B-26B-10 and B-26C. Despite its early accident record, the aircraft became one of the most successful United States-made medium-range bombers. By 1944, the B-26s of the United States 9th Air Force had the lowest loss rate on operational missions of any American aircraft in the European theater, reaching a point of less than 0.5%. Throughout its service, B-26 crews flew over 100,000 sorties, dropping approximately 150,000 tons of bombs, primarily against Nazi Germany. By the end of World War II, the Marauder had been flown by the Americans, British, South Africans, and Free French, with 2 remaining in service as a test bed until 1958. The Fairey Fulmer aircraft looked right and felt right. Comfortable and pleasant to fly, Captain Eric Winkle Brown remembered about the type, quote, "There was little with which the most fastidious of pilots could find fault in its handling." The unsung hero rose to the turbulent skies of the early 1940s, protecting Britain's naval fleets. Amid the volatile Mediterranean, the Fairey Fulmer would down several Italian bombers in the North African campaign, as well as take active participation in chasing the infamous German battleship Bismarck. Born from the tug-of-war between the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, the type emerged as a beloved and trusted aircraft. As Brown said, quote, "In short, everybody liked it." In the swirling currents of the 1930s, the Fleet Air Arm, the aviation branch of the Royal Navy, was undergoing an identity crisis of sorts. It was in an odd position, having its wings, so to speak, clipped by its more robust, land-focused counterpart, the Royal Air Force. With Europe's geopolitical landscape shaping up and Nazi Germany looming large, Britain envisioned no significant fighter threat from the seas, given Germany's lack of aircraft carriers. Instead, the emphasis shifted towards long-range, heavy armament and the crucial ability to navigate the vast and unpredictable oceans, especially under the cover of night or the veil of inclement weather. The RAF's belief was steadfast. Land-based aircraft could tackle any and all aerial threats. In their estimation, any skirmishes beyond the horizon of land-based aircraft were of negligible concern. Still, this matter raised the question of why the RAF wanted to control naval aircraft if they didn't think they were that relevant to their cause. Regardless, this bureaucratic back and forth led to significant consequences for the Royal Navy during the 1930s. The offspring of such oversight were machines like the Blackburn, Skua, and Ruck, naval aircraft that were, to put it mildly, not up to par. While the Royal Navy and RAF's skeptical views on each other's capabilities were often voiced, these sentiments seemed justified during the tumultuous development of the Blackburn naval fighters. These new kids on the block, the Skua fighter dive bomber and the somewhat misguided Ruck turreted fighter, were supposed to revolutionize naval warfare. However, even before they could spread their wings in service, it became abundantly clear. These aircraft would be sitting ducks against the advanced German bombers and fighters. The German threat highlighted another troubling revelation. There would be a wide capability gap before the fleet could welcome a new fighter. Time was of the essence. The British Royal Navy grappled with an urgent need for an aircraft armed to the teeth with advanced deck landing gear. They envisioned fighters that could not only escort bombers deep into enemy territories, but also had the agility to pursue lurking reconnaissance aircraft and the stamina to undertake reconnaissance roles themselves. But it was not just about landing. It required an intricate array of arrestor hooks and catapult stressing. Furthermore, these aircraft had to be equipped with cutting-edge navigational tools, radios, and direction-finding gear. Taking a page from the RAF's playbook, the Royal Navy also sought to instate naval-trained observers responsible for navigating the treacherous skies and operating the equipment. But in this era, shaped by burgeoning technologies and strategic rethinkings, a fleet fighter was seen by many as redundant, its abilities capped by inherent constraints. Moreover, the RAF's skepticism towards carrier-based fighters was deeply entrenched. For them, these aircraft, bound by the rigorous demands of carrier operations, would never hold their own against their land-based counterparts. Such a presumption shaped the Royal Navy's strategy, leading them to bank heavily on fleet carriers brandishing firepower with aircraft nestled safely under armored decks. Lacking advanced air search radars, the notion of these fighters taking on enemy land-based squadrons seemed preposterous. In this mindset, the Admiralty even pondered the idea of arming its new armored carriers solely with strike aircraft. But the voices from the field, those who touched the skies and tasted the salt of the seas, begged to differ. The Royal Navy turned to the RAF's Gladiator. This single-seat biplane, a relic from an earlier age, was hastily repurposed for naval use. Yet its destiny was not the vast decks of fleet carriers. Only a handful of these sea gladiators would taste the salt and storms of the sea between 1939 and 1940, shielding the Royal Naval Air Stations from threats above, serving as a training ground, and allowing FAA pilots to get a taste of the fighter-type aircraft's capabilities. Interestingly, the RAF lacked what the Germans had already mastered, the long-range destroyer Me-110 fighter. It was back to the drawing board for the British. But amidst these challenging circumstances, a glimmer of hope emerged. Contrary to the common conceptions, the renowned Fulmer did not stem from the Fairey battle airframe. Instead, its roots trace back to the RAF's desire to augment its Fairey battle force with a rapid light bomber. Fairey and Hawker were commissioned to craft prototypes, but the program was terminated early. Yet Fairey's promising P-434 fast light bomber prototype arose from this setback. Born from the British Air Ministry's specification P-434, the design was the answer to a call for a light bomber, but not just any bomber, a dive bomber. Alongside Fairey's offering, the race was joined by the Hawker Henley and an ambitious though unbuilt design from Gloucester. While the P-434 boasted an impressive maximum speed of 284 miles per hour, it was outdone by the rival Henley, which darted through the skies at a blistering 300 miles per hour. Despite the Henley speed advantage, fate had other plans, and it found its destiny in a humbler role as a target tug. From these contesting designs, however, a new hero would rise. The new type was not merely the P-434 reborn, but reshaped and reforged for naval might. Specification 0838 underscored the urgent need for a fleet defense fighter, tailored to the unique challenges of naval warfare, or more precisely, a two-seater fighter geared for observation and fleet defense, for the presence of a navigator and wireless operator was deemed essential. Later, renowned World War II test pilot Captain Eric Winkle Brown would recall that, quote, "Sitting imprisoned in the observer's seat of a Fulmer, from which you can see nothing dead ahead, while your trembling pupil gropes for the deck, must be one of the most hair-raising experiences on record." While similar to the older Fairey battle, the Fulmer showcased some design improvements and a more aerodynamic silhouette. Its foldable wings, for instance, were notably shorter by 16 inches. On January 13, 1937, at Fairey Aviation's Great West Aerodrome, now part of London Heathrow Airport, the prototype P-434, identified as K5099, took its inaugural flight with test pilot Chris Stanland. After initial tests, minor adjustments elevated the tail by 8 inches. By 1938, this aircraft was officially named the Fulmer. In recognition of its potential, a bold decision was made that same year, with an order for 127 units. The prototype, intended to revolutionize naval air power, took flight initially as a flying mock-up, It was powered by a single Rolls-Royce Merlin III engine, a beast in itself, boasting an impressive 1,080 horsepower. But even with such a powerful engine, the prototype's maiden voyages were underwhelming, reaching only 230 miles per hour. So the team created a new power plant from scratch. To boost the Fulmar's prowess in the skies, the Merlin 8 engine was tailored specifically for this aircraft, with its supercharging fine-tuned for low-altitude missions. Coupled with many aerodynamic tweaks to the airframe, the Fulmar prototype saw a significant improvement in its speed, soaring at 265 miles per hour at altitudes of 7,500 feet. Given Britain's dire need for state-of-the-art fighters for its naval fleet, the Fulmar's performance was begrudgingly deemed satisfactory. It was, after all, a derivative of an existing model and thus promised quick mass production. By mid-1938, the Royal Navy was already planning an impressive fleet of 127 Fulmars. Interestingly, the aircraft also caught the eye of the Danish Navy, who considered producing it under license. However, the looming shadow of World War II crushed such ambitions. Even though designers proposed a floatplane variant of the Fulmar, this aquatic dream never took flight. January 4th, 1940, was a defining moment in Fulmar's history, when the first production aircraft spread its wings from Fairey's base at RAF Ringway, Manchester, to begin its successful, if humble, career. As Captain Brown put it, quote, "The fact that so short a time elapsed between initial production deliveries and first combat missions spoke volumes for the basic rightness of the Fulmar." Aviation aficionados often marvel at late-war powerhouses like the Corsair, Hellcat, and Seafire, which dominated the skies by 1945, casting a shadow over earlier marvels. Yet nestled within aviation history, the 1940-introduced Fulmar deserves its moment in the spotlight. The Mediterranean of those years was a hotspot of naval skirmishes. In this volatile backdrop, the Fairey Fulmar emerged as a protector of fleets and guardian of convoys, shaping carrier air group dynamics. Judging the Fulmar alongside the war's concluding technological wonders might seem instinctual, but a genuine evaluation takes us to 1940. That year, the Fulmar, despite certain constraints, began its career with the HMS Illustrious, introducing the inaugural squadron of the Fleet Air Arm's Fulmars. The Fleet Air Arm envisioned the Fulmar as a dual-purpose two-seater, adept at communicating key observations and navigating vast seas. This design rendered it bulkier and less agile compared to swift single-seater foes, particularly in the intense Mediterranean environment. Nevertheless, Fulmar's extended reach became its trump card. In 1941, it had a strategic, albeit secondary, role in tracking the famous German battleship Bismarck, with Fulmars from HMS Victorious serving as aerial scouts. During the North African campaign, starting in September 1940, the Fulmar guarded convoys headed to Malta under siege. It solidified its air dominance by downing 10 Italian bombers by October 1940, and it even daringly confronted the mighty Italian battleship Vittorio Veneto during the Battle of Cape Matapan, deflecting its attention to shield more susceptible torpedo bombers. Beyond the Mediterranean, the Fulmar graced other battlefields, aiding in perilous Arctic convoys and the unfortunate Operation EF against Axis installations. However, when the war reached the Pacific in 1942, the Fulmar met an imposing adversary, the nimble Mitsubishi A6M, the Zero. Here, the Fulmar's weaknesses were stark, resulting in 6 of them succumbing to the fleet-footed Zeros and foreshadowing its decline. By January 1941, the world was introduced to the improved Fulmar Mark II. This iteration was more than a cosmetic upgrade. It came equipped with a robust Merlin 30 engine and could carry substantial fuel or even bombs. Testing in October 1941 showcased its impressive range of 1,100 miles, courtesy of its 60-gallon drop tank. Further testing in June 1942 revealed its bombing capacity, safely deploying a 500-pound payload during dramatic dives. Intriguingly, some Fulmars were launched directly from catapults aboard merchant vessels. This tactic was part of a larger strategy to bolster convoy defenses during the war. By 1942, it became evident that the Fulmar needed an upgrade. New, agile fighters like the British Hawker Sea Hurricane and the American Grumman Martlet began replacing it. Yet in the Mediterranean, the Fulmar continued to soar, defending Malta convoys until 1942. Even as its days as a primary fighter waned, the Fulmar found new life in reconnaissance and as a training aircraft. Throughout the war, 20 squadrons were equipped with the Fulmar, making it an integral part of naval aviation. It boasted a record of downing 112 enemy aircraft, crowning it as the Fleet Air Arm's leading fighter in terms of victories. But by February 1945, the Fulmar's frontline days were over. While about 100 Fulmars were converted to night fighters, they achieved only modest success. Some tales even speak of a Fulmar captured by Vichy French forces in 1941, turning the British machine against its creators. Despite its limitations, pilots admired the Fulmar. It had a pleasant flight character, excellent deck handling due to its spaced-out undercarriage, and impressive fuel capacity. Many of the Fleet Air Arm's fighter aces, like Sub-Lieutenant Jackie Sewell and Stanley Orr, earned their laurels in the cockpit of a Fulmar. When the final Fulmar took off, it completed a fleet of no less than 600 examples. It may not have the spotlight, but as Captain Brown stated, quote, "Perhaps the Fulmar lacked the glamour that attached to the single-seat fighters of the day, innate soundness and competence not being the stuff of headlines to set the public's adrenaline flowing." The Messerschmitt 210 was intended to replace the effective yet outdated Bf-110 fighter bomber. Then, after dozens of enhancements, the Me-210 evolved into the Me-410 Hornet in 1942. The German Me-410 quickly proved its value as a bomber-destroyer thanks to its array of armament, which comprised underwing mortars, 30mm cannons, and a colossal 5cm BK cannon. It was also used as a fighter bomber, heavy fighter, reconnaissance platform, and bomber interceptor, becoming a nightmare for the American B-17 formations after realizing that one shot from the Hornet's BK cannon was more than enough to neutralize them. Even the Fuhrer was mesmerized by the Hornet's effectiveness and named it the backbone of the home air defense, trusting that it would keep the Allied air forces at bay. However, its development took several wrong turns, which resulted in several casualties, putting Hitler's high hopes into question. During the 1930s, when the German rearmament was discreetly resurfacing before Hitler's rise to power, the concept of the heavy fighter aircraft was born. Air warfare had come a long way since the first days of World War I, and all major world powers were developing new doctrines and aircraft for a new age of combat. The Americans, British, French, Germans, Japanese, and Soviets were now experimenting with unique designs that could carry more than enough firepower to protect friendly heavy bombers and also be able to blast their way through enemy formations. Germany's response was the Messerschmitt Bf-110, which went through several modifications before the outbreak of the war. Despite its faults, it proved to be a reliable weapon. The Bf-110 successfully spearheaded the air assaults over the skies of Poland in 1939 and the posterior blitzkrieg campaigns of Norway and France during 1940. However, it was not without its disadvantages. The limited maneuverability of the Bf-110 became very noticeable during the Luftwaffe offensive against the British during the Battle of Britain, when it became easy prey for the faster and more maneuverable British aircraft. Historian Martin Windrow said that the Bf-110 was, quote, "easily identifiable from long distances. Its acceleration and speed were insufficient to allow it the luxury of avoiding combat. It was sluggish in evasive maneuvers, its turning circle was wide, and with its large wing and tail surfaces, it presented a good target. The destroyer became the destroyed." Consequently, the Luftwaffe began searching for a new replacement, while the Bf-110 was relegated to a night fighter role. The aircraft excelled in this new position, becoming an essential asset to defend the motherland from air attacks conducted by the American 8th Air Force. Meanwhile, William Messerschmitt, the head of the aviation company that bore his name, was asked by the Ministry of Aviation to develop an improved version of the Bf-110. He complied, but developed a new aircraft instead. It was called the Me-210. Like its predecessor, the Me-210 was also a twin-engined aircraft that could be used for many roles, except that it turned out to be more problematic than the aircraft it intended to replace. Messerschmitt had begun developing it in 1939, almost when the Bf-110 entered service. When the Reich invaded Poland in September of 1939, the Ministry of Aviation immediately issued a requirement for a new aircraft, and the company submitted the Me-110 as if it were a new design. It featured room for 2 crew members, a pilot and a gunner, sitting in tandem under a glazed greenhouse-style canopy. And although it used many of the same parts as the Bf-110, the MA-210 had some key differences. First, it had a different nose, which was shorter and located over the aircraft's center of gravity. Additionally, the MA-210 had a different internal bomb bay, a new wing design for higher speeds, and a remote-controlled defensive armament system with a broader field of fire. The main armament of the MA-210 consisted of two 20mm MG-151 autocannons and two 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns located in the nose. Two 13mm MG-131 machine guns were placed at the rear and were remote-controlled by the gunner. This feature was highly innovative and gave the gunner an ample range of motion to attack enemy aircraft. It also prevented the gunner from shooting his own aircraft's tail off. According to the specifications, the MA-210 was expected to reach up to 620 km per hour, which was more than 80 km faster than the Bf-110. Also, its bomb load capacity was limited to 2,200 tons. The aircraft eventually proved to be highly unstable, as it stalled and spun dramatically under minor flight maneuvers. The engineers then tried to solve the issues by installing a single vertical fin and replacing the original twin-finned assembly. Despite all the problems, the MA-210 entered service after a multitude of different prototypes were built. The Luftwaffe was in desperate need of every aircraft at hand. The most updated version of the aircraft was the MA-210C, taken by the Hungarian Air Force to fight the Soviets. Of the intended 1,000 aircraft, only about 300 were completed and sent to the front lines alongside the remaining Bf-110s. Luther Hart, a radio operator and gunner from the Luftwaffe, was interviewed by Eric Seeger from the Defense Network and recalled using an MA-210. His aircraft was taken away for night fighter use and he was given a brand new MA-210. Quote, "There were many accidents as we were getting trained to fly the 210. The plane would just suddenly drop out of the sky. Nobody could understand what was going on. Our casualties in training were as bad as when we were in Russia. We were later told that there were two problems with the MA-210. The first was that the fuselage was about 1 meter too short. We were also told that there was one little part in the plane, which was ersatz material, which broke and created the problems. To us, it was inconceivable that they could get that airplane into mass production with those problems. They should have found that out beforehand." Like Hart, many crews were given Bf-110s, while the Luftwaffe kept working on another heavy fighter that could replace it. That aircraft would be the Me-410, which Hart called, quote, "a very, very good airplane, but it came too late in the war. During training, one of the Me-410s actually shot down a captured American fighter, a Mustang." The Me-410 Hornet was the most improved version of the short-lived Me-210 design. Still, the company gave it a new designation to differentiate it from that failure. The most significant difference with its predecessor was the introduction of the powerful Daimler-Benz DB603A engines, which gave it a top speed of 625 km per hour and a better rate of climb, service ceiling, and cruising speed. The Hornet could also carry more bombs, with 4 shackles under the wings to support 50-kilogram bombs. These upgrades were all possible after increasing the fuselage length and including leading-edge slats to improve stability. The Hornet was also fitted with 2 20mm MG-151 cannons and 2 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns in the nose. The innovative remote-controlled 13mm MG-131 machine guns were also present and featured improved controls for the gunner to bolster the Hornet's defensive power. Deliveries began in January of 1943 and were favorably accepted by the crews. The aircraft proved to be reliable against enemy formations, and especially bombers. The Me-410 also performed well as a night bomber, and soon became a problem for British night fighters and bombers that went into Germany during nights to bomb cities. This led the Luftwaffe to enhance the Hornet's armament by fitting it with a colossal Rheinmetall 5cm BK or Bordkanone 5 cannon, which was based on the Wehrmacht's 5cm Kampfwagenkanone 39 tank gun. The objective was to cause as much damage as possible against the American 4-engine bombers, such as the B-17 Flying Fortresses, by also being equipped with a highly accurate Zielfernrohr ZFR-4A telescopic sight. This new bomber-destroyer configuration featured the lethal cannon in the undernose bay alongside an extra pair of machine guns, and the idea was to bombard the enemy aircraft before they came within range of the B-17's defensive fire. The BK cannon was fully automatic, as it incorporated a magazine and several mechanisms that controlled the loading process and the recoil each time a round was fired. During an air demonstration, the Führer said that the Hornet was, quote, "the backbone of the home air defense." The aircraft proved to be highly effective against the enemy bomber formations until they changed their defensive strategy and began placing escort aircraft at the front to protect them. The Hornets suddenly became the hunted against more agile enemy fighters such as the Mustangs and Spitfires. By mid-1944, the Hornet would be phased out of production and replaced by single-engine fighters for a bomber-destroyer role. The surviving examples were used for reconnaissance operations and were last seen during the Allied invasion of Normandy in June and July of 1944.